From the beginning, I knew what was happening, which is why it didn't surprise me.
Where they want to get rid of the useless eaters and want to propel us into the fourth industrial revolution.
In a word, yes. The predictions of the Malthusians have been wrong every single generation for 200 years. They're always right. Well, we need to get rid of some people. I would say neo-Malthusianism is part of a broader ideology, which is essentially the justification for the ruling class. If you are rich and wealthy and powerful, it is because your genes are good and you deserve to be rich and wealthy and powerful. Are there limits to growth? And the answer will surprise you. Ultimately is about depopulating the planet in various ways. Well, we can't say that anymore. So they transformed it into population control, which I think has a couple of meanings. Yeah, population control the number of people in the population, but also who are you waiting for to come and do this for you?
What do you think will happen with the elections that will happen in 2 weeks in the United States? Who will win? And maybe more importantly, will there be a civil war?
I know exactly who will win on November 5th.
Welkom bij Weltsmerts. Vandaag hebben we een speciale gast die het Nederlands niet helemaal machtig is. Dus we houden het interview in het Engels. Niemand minder dan James Corbett sluit bij ons aan via een Zoom-verbinding uit Japan. Hi James, you have been a podcaster exposing the deep state since 2007. I've been a fan of your show actually way before COVID. And you've been very consistently going through. Before we get into the main subject, I want to dive back into your childhood years, so to say, to Canada, and what it meant for you to be Canadian, why you moved to Japan, and then ultimately what got you to do podcasts.
Yes, that's an interesting question because, yes, I am Canadian. I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I spent my childhood years there and spent my teenage years there. But my parents were from England, and I ultimately ended up moving to Ireland to study at Trinity College Dublin for a year to get my master's degree in Anglo-Irish literature. And then I moved to Japan, and I've lived here for 20 years now. So what does it mean to be Canadian? What flag should I be saluting exactly? Well, luckily I've solved that by becoming an anarchist, so I don't salute any flag, and I don't consider myself a citizen of any nation. But clearly I have something of the Canadian culture in me, I suppose, but I also have Japanese culture in me at this point. I have my English upbringing. I have my Irish experience. In fact, when I was in Ireland, I had a Dutch girlfriend, so I have some affinity to the Dutch, and for some reason I've found that a lot of my listeners over the years, a disproportionate amount of my listeners have come from the Netherlands. Considering it is not a native English-speaking country, I have had a lot of listeners from the Netherlands over the years. What does that mean? I don't know, but anyway, I suppose in our very vastly interconnected global world, what does it mean for me to be a Canadian at this point? And how and why did I end up becoming a podcaster who's exposing the deep state since 2007? That is not a title I would have ever imagined that I would have in my life. That was certainly not what I was dreaming about or thinking about when I was growing up. Obviously, it didn't even exist when I was growing up. But even so, I never thought I would get into media of any sort. I never had any interest in that. It was just truly my experience of encountering information online that really blew my mind and completely went against everything I'd been taught all my life, that I realized I needed to do something to get that information out to other people. So it was 2007, it's the internet age, so I got on the internet and I started a podcast because that was the new thing. And I thought that was, hey, this is an interesting and convenient way for me to get my message out to people. I hope someone will listen. And here we are, 17 years later, and so far I've reached millions of people around the world, which is not a testament to me or my abilities. It is a testament to the incredible age that we're living in, where just some average English teacher in Japan can reach people all around the world. It's truly an amazing, incredible age that we're living in, for good and for bad.
Yeah, I think you're being overly modest, to be honest. What you've done was kind of revolutionary nowadays. And I think especially during COVID, when we had to lock down, everybody was at home, we've seen an enormous surge of podcast channels. But I think the part of podcasting, and you mentioned it briefly, is twofold. One, the internet gives a vast array of information, and it goes around the prescribed narrative of governments. And the other thing is the information technology, the revolution we had with that you can actually become your own broadcasting channel. So when you started in 2007, was that already very clear to you? Or did it progress over the years that you saw, wow, this is really working to reach millions of people?
Yes, no, this was not a planned thing that I sat down and had some grand vision for, because I don't think it would have worked that way. Really, the website, the podcast, what I was doing was a reflection of what was happening at the time. And when I saw, for example, being here in Japan, I get a lot of my English language media through the internet. And so I was listening to a lot of podcasts. So it only made sense for me to start a podcast. Or back at the time, YouTube was this brand new invention that everybody was getting on board. In a million years, I never would have started a YouTube channel, except, well, I've got this website now and I want to promote it and I want to get the word out. I want to reach people. So I'll start a YouTube channel. So I started doing that. All of these things were just things that happened, that were happening at the time. I didn't really, I mean, I had a sense that something was happening, but I really didn't see it in perspective. But over the years, I have had the opportunity to think about it, because obviously it utterly transformed my life and what I thought I was going to do with my life. So I have put some time and effort into thinking about what the nature of this revolution that we're living through. And as a result, I've produced, for example, a documentary on the media matrix, talking about the evolution of mass media from the time of the Gutenberg print revolution all the way up to our current internet revolution and beyond, and the metaverse and whatever is coming next. And it strikes me that to some extent, you could argue that some of the most significant and important inventions in human history, beyond fire and the wheel and other such basic inventions, but beyond that, communications technology has probably done more to shape and order our world than anything we could think of. And I don't just mean that in the sense of, for example, in the Gutenberg Revolution, suddenly the average person had access to these printing presses that would allow them to send their message out to thousands and tens of thousands, and ultimately, who knows, millions of people. The Reformation, for example, would it have happened without the Gutenberg print revolution? There's a good case you could make that it would not have happened, at least not in that fashion. Similarly, in our age, suddenly the average Joe Schmo in their living room in Japan with a beat up old laptop and a clunky $20 microphone can suddenly start reaching people all around the world. It is truly revolutionary, but I don't just mean that. When you start really getting into it and you look at people like Marshall McLuhan, the author of Understanding Media and other books like that, he talked about the way that, for example, the print revolution didn't just affect the way that we communicate with each other, it affected the way we perceive the world. Suddenly, you have this idea of information is not as we would expect in the oral tradition, where we're listening to things. You take information as a whole, but in the print era, it's broken down into its constituent letters that can then be rearranged, and that's of course how the printing press actually operates. They just rearrange the letters in the case and print a new page. That in and of itself starts reshaping our approach to understanding the universe itself. Suddenly, the ideas that would go on to manifest in the scientific revolution were already in place, that the world itself is amenable to this type of breaking apart and rearranging and putting together again in a different way, which truly, I mean, your mind starts to boggle when you start to think of all of the ramifications of this. So what does the current internet age mean? What does it mean to have this electronic media, as Marshall McLuhan called it back in the 1960s? I think we're just starting to find that out, but certainly it does lead to a different way of perceiving the world around us, and obviously with relating to each other. We are living through a revolution that really, I mean, truly, I think is as significant as the Gutenberg print revolution. Maybe we've seen nothing like it in the past 5 centuries. I think we should be at least thinking about this, talking about it, being aware of it, and of course, very, very aware that exactly like in the wake of the Gutenberg print revolution, where governments tried to crack down on this and start licensing printing presses and trying to find ways to put that cork on the bottle, obviously we're living through that moment right now with governments trying to find ways to try to contain and control the information flowing through the internet. And well, it's an open question how successful they will be at that.
Yeah, so then we're getting into the part of censorship, and I want to zoom into that as well. But first, I want to go back to Japan, because you're based in Japan, you're using English as your mode of communication. Japan is somewhat secluded by culture and by language. So how is your interaction with your surrounding and with your Japanese compatriots, I would almost say it?
Yeah. Well, actually, again, this was, again, not part of my plan because everything just sort of happened. But in some ways, it's probably been a good thing that I have been here in Japan doing what I do for a number of reasons. The most obvious that people might think of is the fact that I am doing this in English in Japan means that in Japan, I'm mostly invisible because most of the population does not speak English, is certainly not following an English podcast. I do have some listeners here, but not that many. So it does kind of make me invisible in a way here, which is probably good. I don't feel the eye of Sauron on my work to that extent, or, intelligence agencies and security services breathing down my back. That might be wishful thinking on my part, but anyway, I don't feel that pressure. It has not manifested itself into me and in my day-to-day life. So I have a very normal existence here, and it's a good place to raise a family. So that's all to the good. But also, being in Japan does give me a certain remove from Canada, from the US, from Europe, from all of these places that I am talking about and covering, which can be to the downside because, yes, I'm not there living it, experiencing it, but it also allows me to have a certain detached view from some of the things and the craziness that's going on, to the point where now, when I go back to Canada, I hardly recognize the place. It is a truly different country and a different culture than the one that I grew up in. And I can be aware of that in a way that my friends and family who obviously have been living in Canada don't really see. So I think it gives me some advantage to at least have a broader perspective on what's going on there.
So then we get into the topic of the deep state. For me, 9/11 was a very significant event that really confronted me with that there is planning behind world events. What was the event for you where you said, like, okay, there is the narrative and there's the reality, and there's people trying to keep those very separate?
It's difficult to say with certainty because for example, I can remember it must have been around the 25th anniversary of the JFK assassination. So that would have been 1988. As I was growing up, I was a young boy at that point, but there were documentaries and things they were airing on TV about, well, was it just Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone, etc. That sort of thing was happening. And I remember just in a cursory glance, even as a tiny boy, I just remember thinking, well, obviously it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone, and everyone knows it, but no one's allowed to say it. So I saw through certain lies that are the types of lies that are propagated in the mainstream media. And another example that comes to mind, I remember vividly being about maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, sitting on the couch watching the evening news with my dad. And there was an evening news segment where they were talking about some new product and how amazing it was and what it would do for your life. And after this news segment aired, I turned to my dad and I said, was that the news or was that an advertisement? And he said, I think it's an advertisement, son. And so that was another time when I realized, oh yeah, okay, the media is playing tricks with us and manipulating us. So I've had that understanding. I've always had something of an anti-authoritarian mindset and questioning what I'm being told. But when it came to 9/11, the actual events of 9/11, on the day of 9/11, at that time, I didn't question what I was being told, at least not deeply. And in fact, for years afterward, I would find even the thought that this was some sort of conspiracy, I would not countenance that. No, that's too far. That's disrespectful, et cetera, all the things we'd been taught and programmed to say. I was exactly like that, and I went along with it for years. It wasn't until 2006 that I started going down the internet rabbit hole and discovering all sorts of information that, yeah, some of it was stupid, speculative, crazy nonsense, but some of it was provable, demonstrable. For example, I didn't need anyone to tell me about it. I could go to the National Security Archive and look at the 1961 Operation Northwoods documents, 1962, sorry, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, all the way up to the desk of President Kennedy, had approved a plan for staging terror attacks and blaming them on Cuba. And Kennedy did not sign off on that plan. But if he had of, we would be living in a very different world. Maybe we wouldn't be living in the world, considering the Cuban Missile Crisis and other events that were taking place at the time. So anyway, those sorts of pieces of information, which again, I'd never heard growing up, really threw me for a loop. And that's when I started to realize, oh, okay, there's something going on here. And the more I dug up, the more I realized we have definitely been lied to about the events of 9/11. And I've been covering that for 17 years now. That was episode 1 of the Corbett Report, was about 9/11. So that was definitely the thing that started me down this process. And really, it's I think of it as a process. It is a process of not just accepting, okay, they say this, therefore that, but coming to my own conclusions based on things that I can dig up and I can see for myself. Because I realize most people, most of the time, don't care. They don't want to put in effort to go and look things up for themselves. Why should I have to? I'll just turn on the news and find out what happened today. And I understand that mindset. Most people have a lot of things to worry about. But me personally, I realized, oh, when I start looking into it, I can put these pieces together in a very different way that's different than what I'm being told. And I know that, oh, this piece of information lines up with this piece of information over here and this piece of information. And it started to form something more akin to an actual map of the terrain that we're living on, geopolitically and socially and economically and everything else. It started to make sense of the world in a way that, well, the information that I was getting from mainstream news certainly wasn't. So yes, 9/11 was sort of my entree into this, but it was the process of digging up and finding and sourcing information for myself that just is that snowball that continues to roll down the hill right to the present day.
Yeah, so we see a few things. The collusion between media and governments, or intelligence agencies, as I should say, and we can add social media and the censorship industrial complex. But if I were to ask you, after 17 years of doing the first podcast and having spoken with many people about this particular subject, 9/11, doing a lot of research, what is your assessment at this moment? Because it's, as you said, an ongoing process, but who do you think staged and planned it?
It's an excellent question, and I suppose if I could answer that with authority, I would be doing lawsuits or something along those lines. I would be doing something at any rate to draw attention to that. My unsatisfying answer is going to be, I cannot tell you with any certainty what happened on 9/11, and I know there are a lot of people who will beat their chest and tell you that they can. They are either lying, or I guess they could have been involved in the plot, but well, anyway, from my information that I have absolutely 100% solidly nailed down, and as people who know my work know, when I do a documentary, for example, about 9/11 trillions, 9/11 whistleblowers, 9/11 war games, false flag, the secret history of Al-Qaeda, I will put the entire transcript, hyperlinked, every single source, every document, everything that I talk about will be there. And so from all of that research, I know that I can say 100% that the 9/11 Commission report sitting on my shelf back there is a load of lies, and not just a load of lies, actually, a load of lies that were derived from torture. Obviously illegal torture sessions of people who had been kidnapped, tortured, had their children threatened with torture, etc., in order to extract a certain story that we know is full of lies and can be demonstrably shown to be that. So what did actually happen? There are things that I think we can say with certainty, one of which, from my perspective and from all of the research I've done, the buildings did not fall down in the way that we are expected to believe. They simply collapsed. They were explosions, demolitions of a kind, although not exactly the kind that we usually see. And thus there's many things that can and should be said about that. But luckily, the 9/11 truth movement has become all about the buildings and the way they blew up. So I'm happy to cover literally every other aspect of 9/11, which includes such things as the 9/11 money trail. We can prove, for example, 100% there was informed trading before the events. This was one of those stories that broke even in the mainstream media in the weeks following the events of 9/11. It was reported openly. There is ongoing SEC investigation. The investigators are finding there are these millions of dollars in put options that were placed before 9/11. We later come to find out it wasn't just put options, but call options, not just on the airlines, but on numerous stocks related, for example, to numerous companies that were in the World Trade Center, related to defense contractors, for example, that suddenly saw their profits rising in the wake of the launching of the War of Terror, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this whole story, and eventually no one really followed it through to its end, because as it was discovered, well, first of all, there are not one, not two, but three separate published peer-reviewed papers from economists demonstrating that, yes, there was informed trading before the attacks. The trading that was taking place was unusual. But the SEC investigation itself, what happened with that? Well, we'll never really know, because they destroyed the records of it in part of routine record keeping. But researchers like Kevin Ryan have dug up some of the records from the 9/11 Commission investigation, et cetera, that have demonstrated that, don't worry, guys, the FBI followed that trail back to the source of at least some of those trades and found out that that person had nothing whatsoever to do with Al-Qaeda, and thus, well, obviously couldn't have had anything to do with the attacks, because we know the attacks were done by Al-Qaeda, right? Or at least that was the pretzel logic that they used to dismiss it. Oh, who was that person? Oh, it turned out to be a cousin of the Bush family who was working with the Bush family, for example, in Securicom and other companies that were related to the events of 9/11 itself. Again, it's a fascinating story. If people are interested, Kevin Ryan wrote a book called Another 19, where he talks about another 19 suspects, not the guys with box cutters that we saw the pictures emblazoned of, but another 19 people who could plausibly be, at the very least, we should be putting them before a tribunal and asking them under oath about various aspects of what happened. And unfortunately, I think unless and until we got such an actual tribunal with real teeth that would be capable of trying people under oath, we probably won't get to the operational nitty-gritty details. But anyway, that's just one example of one of the paths that you could look at. You could look, for example, at the war games. I've looked at all of the various drills, exercises, simulations, war games that were taking place on and around 9/11, all sorts of things, hijacked jets being flown into New York, hijacked planes being flown into government offices that were happening on the day of 9/11. Of course, NORAD drills that were infamously going on that day, to the point where every single time a hijacking was being reported, they had to clarify, is this real world or exercise, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many other things that add up to the point that, at the very least, I think there's no doubt that there were people involved in the US military and intelligence apparatus who absolutely knew what was going on that day and were actively stifling the response that would have, under any normal circumstances, prevented four hijacked aircraft from flying wildly off course for up to an hour without being so much as intercepted by a single fighter jet. Absolute nonsense, total fairyland, unreality, but it was what played out on our TV. We all saw it, so I guess we all just go along with it. Anyway, there are many things like that that I can absolutely 100% prove. Absolutely. There's no doubt that, for example, the Department of Defense, officials from the Department of Defense lied under oath to the 9/11 Commission about the timeline of what happened and their response that day, to the point that there were 9/11 commissioners who wanted to actually bring criminal charges against various people at the Department of Defense for their lies. But, well, that wouldn't look good, so they decided not to prosecute. There were 9/11 commissioners themselves. There was one who resigned, saying that it was a political put-up. The commission heads, Kane and Hamilton, in their book about the commission, ultimately said we were set up to fail. So I think we can see there were powerful interests that were all around this event, from before it happened to the day of it happening to the cover-up that took place afterward. And that to me should be enough for the average person to, as I say, be interested in bringing these people before a tribunal or some sort of commission that would have real teeth to actually put them under oath.
I am very much in favor of tribunals. Now, if we go to a more recent date, Israel has called the Hamas raid on the 7th of October last year their 9/11. And in a way, I agree with them, because they're also the response before with the intelligence and after with the IDF is, of course, completely ludicrous and impossible. And many people in those communities are actually acknowledging it. So do you see a similarity between those attacks?
Yes. In fact, I shortly after the events themselves, I released a podcast under that name, Israel's 9/11, where I exactly agree with you 100%. Yes, I think this is their 9/11 insofar as it's clearly, truly not what they told us it was. And we can demonstrate that again from numerous different aspects. Just on its face, the breach of the most heavily surveilled border on the planet, which to the point there, if so much as a cat approaches the fence, there will be alarms going off, there will be people notified, there will be IDF personnel who will be responding to that within minutes, is the testimony of people who have actually worked on the border wall. And oh, by the way, that was 20 years ago, back before we even had internet. So how much more involved is it now with the literal AI targeted guns and other such things that they have on the border there? But no, they suddenly we have this breach, this incredible, unprecedented breach with paragliders, etc., and literally rampaging for hours, literally hours, without any IDF response at all. And then when the IDF do respond, as it turns out, they were implementing the Hannibal Directive, which is to kill everyone, kill Israelis, kill Palestinians, kill them all, kill everyone in the kill zone, and then sort it out later. And that's exactly what happened. We have testimony, for example, of Israelis who were hiding in various locations in the kibbutzes and in the communities there that were being bombed and shelled and killed. We have testimony from IDF commanders about that. So again, it's not conspiracy theory. We have then all of the atrocity propaganda that resulted from that has been widely debunked. I believe Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone has a new documentary out about the atrocity propaganda and the beheaded babies, for example, which is, again, one would think that the script for atrocity propaganda would be updated from the time of, say, World War I, where we had the babies on bayonets. Or, of course, the Gulf War, we had the babies thrown from incubators. And now in 2023, we have the beheaded babies, which, oh, by the way, never really happened. But it was effective in its job of getting the people shocked. Okay, so there's a lot that we can go into with regard to that. But yes, ultimately, I agree. What happened on 10/7 is about as believable in its official form as what happened on 9/11. I don't think this was a strike out of the blue. And then, similarly to 9/11, for example, I did a 5.5-hour documentary about false flags, the secret history of Al-Qaeda, talking about what is Al-Qaeda, what is this organization, where did it come from, who is Osama bin Laden, and who were the various people associated with him, like Ali Mohammed and other really interesting characters like that they never talk about in the mainstream media. Well, what was this? And through that 5.5-hour exploration, you find out, oh, absolutely, Al-Qaeda 100% was receiving assistance from the intelligence agencies and may have been more or less a creation of the intelligence agencies, depending how you look at it. At any rate, Hamas is openly, this is not conspiracy theory. Again, it's been reported in the Times of Israel and other mainstream publications. The Israeli government has been propping up Hamas for years with the express and deliberate intention of dividing Palestinians between Gaza and the West Bank, so that they can never cooperate. It will always be Hamas will be this militant boogeyman that is conveniently basically lording over Gaza. And they say, oh, well, they won an election back in 2006. Therefore, every single person in Gaza is an enemy combatant, is essentially what they're saying. They don't quite come out and say that, but that is obviously what they are treating it as right now, which is particularly disgusting because 50% of the population of Gaza is under 18. So these are clearly people who had absolutely nothing to do with whatever election did or didn't happen in 2006, who are now being held responsible for the metaphorical sins of the father, who, oh, by the way, was being supported by Netanyahu. It's a disgusting situation, the more you look into it. But the underlining part of all of this disgusting situation is, of course, the response. Even, let's take 10/7 100% at face value. It was exactly what they said it was. It was this horrible atrocity. What has resulted from that is still, by any stretch of the imagination, utterly inexcusable. It is disgusting. It is, within our lifetime, probably one of the greatest atrocities that has ever played out, is the targeting and decimation of civilian life and infrastructure in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, as part of a coordinated campaign to ultimately ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people, as talked about by numerous people in the Israeli government. Words fail me, and I speak words for a living. So it's really overwhelming to even try to encapsulate this. But essentially, what we are witnessing right now is one of the greatest war crimes in the history of humanity.
Exactly. And the hypocrisy in the West tells us that there must be a plan behind it, because the West loses its moral high ground and any credibility it had left. I want to take you to another event, and that's COVID-19. Now, what I find similar is the response, the false flag, etc. So we can clearly see it follows the same pattern, but there's one major difference. It's on the fly. It's more or less still going, but it has been going on with lockdowns, etc., for 2 years, which makes it very distinctly different from 9/11 or the 7th of October, which was one day, and then they just have to spin around and keep regurgitating the narrative about that one day that is now in the past. With COVID-19, it's a bit different. Yes, they use the same fear tactics, the same media control, the same narrative spinning, but they had to keep it going. So where I think COVID-19 has given us a unique opportunity is because we were living through the false flag. We actually had enough time to realize, hey, this is really happening, and they're really lying, and there's really a money incentive. For instance, big tech, big pharma has made huge amounts of money. There is a government incentive, namely the surveillance state. And what I've been seeing since then is that millions of people have woken up to that reality and are now critical about everything. Have you seen that same thing?
I have certainly seen, and I had cause to see it because I was certainly there documenting it. And at the time, I was still on YouTube. This was before I'd been censored off that platform. So I still had access to a large audience. And I was seeing that audience growing in a way that I'd never seen in the previous 15 or so years that I'd been doing this work. So clearly, there's a lot of people who were shaken out of their slumbers by the events of COVID-19. Whatever those events really were. But the question is, do they stumble out into the light and everything, oh, now they understand everything, or do they stumble into the next trap? And that might be the question. But yes, I had a good position to see the COVID-19 events unfolding because let us not forget that really, to a certain extent, the entire narrative around this pandemic and bioterrorism and all of these things were swirling around on 9/11 as well. Because let's not forget, what was the next major event right after 9/11 were the anthrax attacks, these letters that were sent to congressmen, journalists, assorted others that were killing people. Oh my God, the anthrax in the mail. And it turned out to be not just run-of-the-mill anthrax. This was super weaponized anthrax. In fact, incredibly well weaponized anthrax. This must have come from a nation-state sponsor. Oh, it must have been Iraq. Until, of course, it was discovered, oh, actually, no, this is way beyond Iraq-grade bentonite-laced anthrax. This was super, unbelievably high-tech weaponized anthrax that came from Fort Detrick. Oh, okay, let's cover that up and never talk about it again. Oh, it was Bruce Ivins. He killed himself. Case closed. So I obviously was interested in that story as just part of my research into 9/11. So I was covering that and looking into that at the time, and the whole Bruce Ivins story and all of that. And so as a result, I had been following the the effects of that anthrax attack, which, by the way, let's not forget, there was Dark Winter, which was a simulation that happened in the summer before 2001 about a terrorist group using, I believe it was smallpox in the simulation, but causing a gigantic, health event that would require quarantines and emergency vaccinations and other such things. And lo and behold, just a couple of months later, oh, we have this event. They blamed it on terrorists initially. They eventually decided that wasn't going to stick and abandoned it, and we never hear about it anymore. But one of the results of that was in the United States, for example, the creation of a Model State Health Emergency Powers Act, which was it was legislation. It was essentially a template that each state could use to forward through their state legislatures that would give their governors powers to quarantine and powers to force vaccinate, etc., in the event of some declared health emergency. Also, that fed into the 2006 amendments of the World Health Organization's International Health Regulations, which created this thing called FAKE, interestingly enough, the Public Health Emergency of International Concern, PHEIC, which grants the WHO these powers to come in and declare this international emergency and to start issuing guidelines that, don't worry, guys, your individual nation states can decide for themselves what to do with our guidelines and recommendations. It's just that in the event of, say, COVID-19, every single state on the planet essentially did the same thing. And those few states that resisted, like, some of those African leaders that tested cans of Coke and found them to be COVID positive, well, they end up with a heart attack and getting replaced by a leader who would go along with the plan. So again, we can see where that's coming from. So back in 2009, for example, I had a podcast on medical martial law talking about the possibility of some sort of event and the lockdowns and quarantines and forced vaccinations, etc. I think I got a lot of laughter from people at that time. That's ridiculous. That will never happen. But when we started to see exactly that taking place in early 2020, I knew exactly what script they were working from. And it's like so many other situations, even if it's exactly as they said it was just this natural thing that just spread and it's really there and it's really killing people. Even if that was the case, at any rate, they had the entire biosecurity infrastructure in place and they needed an event to justify, as was talked about in a Milken Institute talk in October of 2019, at which Anthony Fauci was one of the speakers. There was a discussion where they talked about the fact these wonderful, amazing new technologies, mRNA vaccines, DNA vaccines, this wonderful experimental technology, we need this and we need it to be developed, but it's going to cost big pharma billions of dollars and it'll take them a decade to even try to bring something to market, and maybe it won't even work. And they openly mused there in October 2019. Don't take my word for it. Go watch it for yourself. But they openly mused about, well, wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of big scare, some big pandemic, and the government could step in and move things along? Well, just a few months later, that's exactly what happened. What a coincidence. So anyway, yes, I definitely saw COVID-19 for what it was from the beginning. I knew what was happening, which is why it didn't surprise me, but it surprised a lot of people. And I heard from a lot of people who absolutely were amazed, staggered at what was happening and couldn't believe what was happening. And to whatever extent we can use the phrase woke up, well, I think a lot of people woke up during COVID. But what did they wake up to? And what did they really take out of those events is, I think, still an open question.
I agree with you that the awakening community is not awake yet. They are in a process, but at least it started. And I think that's a net positive. The other thing that I want to focus on, now, this audacity with COVID-19 was a few steps higher than with 9/11, for instance. But I track the origin back to the United States deep state or the Anglo-Saxon deep state. Do you have that same feeling that all these world events are carefully orchestrated by one particular group of people?
I think my vision of the deep state is not nation state based. I think a lot of the people that would be actors in this deep state are not people who think of themselves as beholden to any particular nation state anyway. And we can look at specific examples of that. For example, one character that I documented quite a bit back in the past was Morris Strong. And read his biography, and it's absolutely incredible. A junior high school dropout who goes on to become an oil patch millionaire, and then a UN environment crusader who heads every single organization that you could possibly think of. It's absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, at the end of his life, he ended up fleeing to China because he ended up getting implicated in the oil for food bribery scam that was being perpetrated in Iraq. So he just fled to China because it's not like he was Canadian, but it's not like he lived or cared about Canada per se. He spent time in America. He spent time all around the world. There are many characters like that where I guess nominally they have some sort of citizenship, but I don't think that really pertains at the end of the day. Anyway, I think the fealty and allegiance of these types of deep state players is more to each other, to their networks, to their ultimate end goals, not to any nation state. So yes, I think the deep state, broadly described, certainly, absolutely did have its tentacles all over the COVID events. But yes, and I think a lot of them are American. When we look, for example, at Bill Gates and organizations that are surrounding the Gates Foundation, for example, a lot of them tend to be based in America, but some aren't. And some are CEPI and Gavi and these other sort of international organizations that have participation from European governments, etc. So there is a lot of overlap and international cooperation on this. And COVID itself, as you say, I mean, 9/11 was clearly an American event that took place in America and was localized, but this was clearly a truly global event and truly did transcend every national boundary. So the deep state, I think we have to broaden our view of that. I don't think there certainly are people who are more powerful and influential, and yes, they tend to be in that Anglo-American orbit, but I think there's people all over the world that are happy to be part of that network.
Yeah, and that brings me to the goal. So when I try to decipher it, you mentioned Maurice Strong. Of course, he was a puppet for the lineage of the Rockefellers, I would say. They have been very instrumental in pushing a narrative that is not so commonly known to people, and that's called neo-Malthusianism. Do you think that this new brand of neo-Malthusianism, which is also branded as One Health approach, is actually driving the COVID narrative? And does it serve a purpose of the utopian social engineering where they want to get rid of the useless eaters and want to propel us into the fourth industrial revolution?
Yes. In a word, yes. So if I were to elaborate on that, for people who don't know, Malthusian means a follower of Thomas Malthus, who was a late 18th, early 19th century English person who also worked for the Anglo-Dutch company. No, what's that called? Anyway, that company that bestrode the world at the time. Anyway, sorry, brain fart there. But Thomas Malthus was famously ringing the alarm bell about the fact that population grows exponentially while our food supply grows arithmetically. And look, I've done the math. Within a generation, everyone's going to be out of food and we're all going to be eating each other. It's just, here it is, guys. You see this math on this page. Oddly enough, that didn't happen. Actually, his predictions were wrong. In fact, the predictions of the Malthusians have been wrong every single generation for 200 years. But still, they're right. They're always right. It's just, it's just around the corner. No, just a little bit longer, guys. So yes, people probably don't know the word neo-Malthusian, but they know the idea because we've been fed it our entire lives. I vividly remember the population bomb scaremongering, or at least the leftover of that was still working in my childhood. That was coming out of the 1960s, and people like Paul Ehrlich, who were promoting this kind of charlatanry. But the idea is so popular because it seems to make a certain common sense. Yeah, there's more and more and more people, and we're fighting over the small amount of resources. You know, obviously there are too many people. We obviously need to do something about that. And of course, the dark shadow of that is always, well, we need to get rid of some people. But, usually the neo-Malthusians won't come out and say that directly, but sometimes they do. And in fact, I have done some editorials recently where I've collected some of the quotes about depopulation that even what they say on the record is stunning. For example, Prince Philip talking about, I'd like to come back as a virus to do my part to eliminate some of the overpopulation, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just truly sickening when you start to think about the ramifications of that. But I would say neo-Malthusianism is part of a broader ideology, which is essentially the justification for the ruling class. And for the past couple of hundred years, that justification has been the idea of eugenics for 150 years or so, which is that there are certain people who, by dint of their superior genes, are fit to rule over others. And as a result of that, there's a lot of things that follow from that. One of them is that if you are rich and wealthy and powerful, it is because your genes are good and you deserve to be rich and wealthy and powerful. If you're poor and struggling to make ends meet and more likely to fall into crime, it's because you have bad genes. You have criminal genes, you see. That's why it happens. So it's automatically a way for the ruling class that exists to justify its own existence and the status quo, which obviously appeals to everyone who would consider themselves part of the deep state. But also it feeds into, for example, that neo-Malthusian idea because they can latch on to this, which again appeals to many people. It seems to make a certain sense. By the way, it is scientifically wrong. And if people want more about that, they can see a podcast that I did on, are there limits to growth? And the answer will surprise you if you believe the usual answer to that question. But anyway, they can use that as a way to get people on board with an agenda that ultimately is about depopulating the planet in various ways. And it takes different forms in different eras. In the early 20th century, it was just straight out eugenics / dysgenics, where literally anyone who was anybody, yes, of course, we need the good genes to thrive and we need to get rid of the bad genes. There was all of the involuntary sterilization laws, not just in the United States, but throughout the globe. In fact, of course, infamously, Hitler and the Nazis copied many of their sterilization and eugenics policies directly from America, and they used that as a conscious template, but throughout many different countries. And so it was out in the open eugenics. After World War II, they had to kind of take it underground and cover it up. Well, we can't say that anymore. So they transformed it into population control, which I think has a couple of meanings. Yeah, population control the number of people in the population, but also control the population. I think it means both things. That also fed into the growing environmental movement. So we had the entire modern environmental movement, which is based solely and completely around carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, is essentially a proxy for that. We have too many people, we need to get rid of people, because that is where it ultimately always comes down to. We're going to measure people in carbon footprints and then reduce the carbon footprints. How do we do that? Well, we reduce your lifestyle and, we reduce the number of people. So again, it comes back to that. And I think in the 21st century, the eugenics ideology is going to take the form of technocracy. What we really need, we need to start measuring out the economy not in dollars or euros or yen. You have to be allotted a certain energy, will be stewarded over by these technicians and engineers who will be able to come in and tell you exactly how much. So they apportion you a UBI, essentially, in carbon credits. It's all coming into place. And anyway, down to the level of can you or can you not transact at the day-to-day level, that will be controlled from a central location. And now we're seeing the CBDC technology and everything else that's coming online, which is really pushing us in that direction of the completely controlled planet, essentially. And I think that is, of course, the dream of today. Tyrants throughout history, all of human history, what if tyrants wanted to have the most control that they can possibly have in the fewest possible hands? And back thousands of years ago, it was Roman emperors who wanted to control the Roman Empire. Well, today it's people in suits and ties who are trying to control, sense, literally every action happening in the globe, moving around the globe. We want to be able to control their movements, and ultimately we want to tinker with you down to your genomic level, and we'll call it vaccines for some sort of pandemic. And that's really what's happened. Whether people see it or not yet, it becomes more manifest. And as the maxim of "you will own nothing and be happy" starts to become an unfortunate reality for more and more people.
I agree with you completely, and I feel that this particular subject that we are now discussing is just catching on. I mean, we saw this in 2020, but that notion that the people that look over us are not doing it for us, but for themselves with ulterior motives, of course, is true. And that brings me to the Fourth Industrial Revolution and censorship. I feel that the agenda that is pursued is actually failing or faltering. And now we see a flee forward, that these people want to ram it through and accelerate the agenda, breaking the narrative even more. How do you look at that?
I think there is that sense. And that is reflected, for example, in Agenda 21 truly was aiming at some sort of fundamental transformation by the year 2000. They didn't get that, so they went with the Millennium Development Goals that became the Sustainable Development Goals, which are now aiming at 2030. And we see an increasing number of programs, UN level, national level, international groups working towards this 2030 agenda. But they've just held an emergency meeting at the UN because we're falling behind on our SDG goals, etc. So I think there is the sense, and I have had the sense, I have nothing to base this on but speculation, but I have had the sense that COVID was to some extent a desperation more than one of power. It seems like it was rushed, and it seems like that all things weren't lined up properly for them to implement that in the way that would best for them. So again, that's speculation on my part, but it certainly does seem that way. So I think there is some... I think the tendency when people start to see the nature of this intricate, generations long, $1 billion agenda of control that seems to be operating at every level, in every sort of government, in every international institution, people get overwhelmed and they start to think of it as this all-powerful thing that cannot be defeated. But something that I always like to stress is that the power that any presumed government or international body has, it is always our power. It comes from us. It comes from our participation. It comes from our labor. It comes from our energy and resources being pumped into this system. That is how they get power. And if we realize that, start directing our time, our resources towards things that we want to manifest in the world, not this biosecurity, digital ID, panoptic prison they're building for us, but the communities of interest that we want to build for ourselves. I think we could change the world. And that's the message that I think we need to get out to more people, because again, as they wake up, I think they need to wake up to the fact that this isn't, there's no, who are you waiting for to come and do this for you? You have to step into the ring and start building the world that you want. And we can do it if we take off the mental blinders and the attitude of, oh, they control everything. As long as we believe that, then they will control everything. But we have to understand the power is ours.
I can't agree more. Now, final question. What do you think will happen with the elections that will happen in 2 weeks in the United States? Who will win? And maybe more importantly, what will happen around it? Do we see an uprising? Will there be a civil war? Will Trump turn things around? What is your prediction?
I'll tell you what. I know exactly who will win on November 5th or whenever it is. I don't even know because I don't care to that extent. But I will tell you who will win. It will be the deep state that will win. And there are many, 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 many different ways that we could understand and look at that. But for example, you can look at the Silicon Valley billionaires that are backing either side. So Bill Gates is just came out, I think it was, had $50 million in donations to the Harris campaign. Musk is spending tens of millions of dollars on the Trump campaign. His VP pick, JD Vance, is a hand-picked, hand-cultivated, made man of the Thiel-verse from Peter Thiel. I mean, it's such a sham that even to countenance the idea of like, oh, let's talk about Trump versus Harris and who's, what. It's a complete charade. I would like to think that more people are waking up to it, but unfortunately, more people are probably going to sleep to it because it's the most important election of your lifetime. Where have I heard that before? Anyway, more importantly, yes, what will eventuate from this stupid sideshow spectacle circus? There are a number of things that could happen. You raise the specter of civil war. Whatever that means, whatever that looks like, I think it is already engaged in to some extent. I mean, there clearly is a cultural civil war that is taking place in the United States and in many countries around the world right now. And it is getting nastier and nastier. And it's hard to imagine a result that will happen in this selection that most people would just go, oh, okay, all right, let's go, yeah, whatever. No, it's going to amp people up. So that could be played upon. And I think, unfortunately, it's a question of the would-be controllers. Do they want to egg it on and juice it up and promote it on CNN and all their controlled media platforms and make it into something real or not? And I think that might be the deciding factor as to whether most people would go along with it at this point. So the real antidote to this, of course, is to turn off CNN and these other mainstream platforms and start getting your news from actual real human beings in the real world. I'm not holding my breath for that to happen. But yes, I mean, the results of what will happen in November are much more important than the event itself.
Thank you very much. Do you have a message of hope, or can we end the conversation on a positive note? What do you see for the future for humankind?
Well, look, as I say, we are living through the most incredible revolution potentially in half a millennia. I mean, it is an incredible time to be alive, and I feel that, I understand that from my own perspective. Me being here talking to you right now is a miracle on so many different levels, and I don't take that for granted, and I don't take it lightly. So I think people should at least have that perspective. We are living through an incredible time, and in any incredible time, of course, it's going to be destabilizing, and there's going to be all sorts of things happening, dramatic events that from the inside are going to look very scary, and things could look very bad. But on the other side of that revolution, what happens? And if the Gutenberg Revolution taught us anything, it's that they can't really put the cork back in that bottle. Yeah, they can try, and they can try to put on licensing for printing presses and what have you, but it doesn't work in the long run. It doesn't contain things, and it ultimately will change the world in ways we can barely dream about. What is the reformation that will happen as a result of the Gutenberg Revolution 2.0? We'll find out, I guess. And I don't know about anyone else, but I don't want to be a spectator in that. I don't want to be just a line in some history book of, oh yeah, and millions of people watched as this was happening. No, we are history's actors. We are writing history right now. So I can't tell you how it's going to end up. I can't say, but we have some part to play in that. And I don't know, I'm here. I'm going to play my part in the best way I can. I hope other people will do that too. If they're interested, they can check out corbettreport.com. I have a regular series called Solutions Watch, where I'm looking not at the horrible bad things that happened yesterday that probably won't affect your life in any way. I'm looking at things that you can do in your life to actually change your life and hopefully the world in general. So if people are interested in that, I hope they'll follow me.
Great. I hope that you keep doing this very important work, and that we both keep participating and stimulate and inspire other people to do the same. And that in another 17 years, where you will continue your podcast, we will look on this episode or this epoch and say, well, it kind of went as we thought and we hoped. Thank you very much for this conversation.
I hope so too. And you know what? If I'm still doing this in 17 years, I hope it's a literary podcast and I'm just talking about books or something, so I don't, because it won't matter. None of this politics, schmolitics nonsense. It'll all be over and we'll all be happy. I'm looking forward to that time and coming to hopefully greet you there in the Netherlands itself. But until then, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Great, thanks. So we will edit it, send you a copy. Do you want to have a look at it first before we publish it, or are you okay with it as it is?
Yeah, no, however you put it together, it's up to you.
Thanks. Great talking to you, and really nice that there are many people now that really understand the thing behind it.
Exactly. More the merrier.
Yes.
All right, I got to get going, but
Yes.
thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.